Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jason McGee, and I'm here representing Shielded Labs. I'm joined by Tomek Petrowski from Eiger, and today we're going to provide an overview of the Zcash Sustainability Fund. We'll discuss its objectives, how it functions, and the current status of its development, and we'll also cover the implementation process and our anticipated timeline for completion. Next slide. So recently, there's been an increased attention around Bitcoin's future security budget due to the possibility that miner revenue from transaction fees may not be sufficient to provide network security after the block subsidy ends. The concern comes from Bitcoin's decreasing block reward schedule, which halves every 4 years. As the block reward diminishes over time, the incentive for miners to secure the network relies increasingly on transaction fees. However, if the volume of transaction and the fees associated with them do not grow to compensate the reduced block reward, the security of the network could be compromised. This could lead to a reduction in the number of miners, resulting in decreased network hash rate and increased vulnerability to 51% attacks, where a single entity could gain control over the majority of the network's hash rate. So Zcash faces a similar problem, as it's a fork of Bitcoin with a network that's sustained by block rewards, and it operates with a supply cap of 21 million coins. So the Zcash Sustainability Fund is an attempt to address this issue of network security. It's a modification to the issuance mechanism. It maintains the 21 million coin cap and enables deposits of ZEC from the circulating supply into future block rewards in order to sustain the network. It's compatible with proof of work or proof of stake, and it's an important step for future economic upgrades like Zcash shielded assets, and it has other use cases like protocol fees and other user applications. Next slide. So before we get into the details of the project and how the Zcash Sustainability Fund works, let's start with some background. I'll explain how the project was originally proposed and how Shielded Labs, along with Eiger, came to spearhead its development. So the Zcash Sustainability Fund was originally named the Zcash Posterity Fund. It was proposed by Nate Wilcox, formerly of the Electric Coin Company, in August 2022. And in a blog post, Nate outlined his general vision for the project. He said the Posterity Fund would replace the current Zcash issuance mechanism with a new mechanism that preserves the 21 million supply cap and smooths out the emissions curve while maintaining an approximate issuance rate that replaces the 4-year halving cycle. It also introduced the new mechanism that allowed for deposits into the fund to be distributed over time in future block rewards. There was some community discussion around the project, but it never made it onto the ECC's roadmap, as there were other engineering priorities that took precedent. These included things like delivering world-class UX and for Zcash and also proof of stake. And then in 2023, I established Shielded Labs as this independent Swiss-based Zcash organization. Its mission is broad. It's to increase user adoption, develop new use cases for Zcash, and contribute to protocol development. There's 2 primary reasons I created Shielded Labs. It was one, to increase decentralization by having more organizations contributing to Zcash development, and second, to make Zcash more resilient by having more geographic diverse ecosystem. So Shielded Labs chose the Zcash Posterity Fund as its first project for a few different reasons. First off, it aligned with our commitment to contribute to protocol development. Historically, protocol development has been handled by the Electric Coin Company and the Zcash Foundation, and we like the idea of a network upgrade being initiated by an independent development team. Second, from a technical perspective, we saw the project as sort of low-hanging fruit and relatively easy for a small team to implement. Overall, it seemed well worth the effort in terms of the benefit it would bring the ecosystem. And then third, we thought it provides an opportunity for Zcash to continue to improve on Bitcoin's design. So if you think of privacy and the development fund as 2 important features that define Zcash's identity and differentiate it from Bitcoin, the Zcash Sustainability Fund allows Zcash to sort of continue that tradition by providing a mechanism for long-term network security. excuse me, we hired Eiger, which is part of the Equilibrium Group, to lead development. I was familiar with their team as a member of the Zcash Community Grants Committee. They've received a few different grants for Ziggurat, which is this network test suite for zcashd and ZBRD nodes. And I knew they had a proven track record, and they seemed like a good fit to lead technical development for the project. And then lastly, we changed the name to the Zcash Sustainability Fund because we felt that it reflects its purpose of, ensuring long-term sustainability of the network. If you like, sustainability kind of gives this idea of maintaining the network's viability over the time, whereas posterity is more about like future generations and doesn't capture the idea of ongoing support for the network. Next slide. All right, so what is the Zcash Sustainability Fund? Well, I think the best way to answer this question is to say what it is not, because it's often misunderstood due to its name. So first of all, the ZSF has nothing to do with the Zcash Development Fund that goes to ECC, the Zcash Foundation, and the Zcash Community Grants Committee. It doesn't finance specific projects or development efforts. Instead, it functions like as a protocol mechanism to help support the network. Second, it's not an organization with a staff or administrative structure, and it's not controlled by an organization. No one owns or manages it. It operates according to, predefined rules set within the protocol. And then lastly, despite its name, it's not a fund in the traditional sense. You can think of a fund as a pool of money managed by individuals or like invested in assets, and there is no fund. The ZSF it's not held in a pool like the Orchard pool. It's essentially unissued and accounted for via the consensus rules. So it's a mechanism within the protocol designed to ensure the long-term allocation of these resources for network security. So then what is the Zcash Sustainability Fund? As I said earlier, it's really best to think of it as a modification to the issuance mechanism that maintains the 21 million coin cap and enables deposits of ZEC from the circulating supply into future block rewards in order to sustain the network. The new issuance mechanism mirrors the payout rate of the original issuance mechanism over a long period of time. And there are a number of different use cases that this change enables that can be implemented by the community in the future. But before we get to that, I just want to discuss what happens upon implementation. Next slide, please. So what happens when the ZSF is activated? So upon implementation, the current ZEC issuance mechanism is suspended and replaced by the ZSF. In each block, the ZSF payout is distributed to block reward recipients, and then users, applications, and other protocol extensions can make deposits into the ZSF. With regards to the payouts, there's a limitation in that the ZSF payouts, which approximate the 4-year half-life, and the payout rate cannot be increased beyond that 4-year half-life constraint. So future protocol changes have to adhere to that limitation. Our proposal, I like to call it modest, in that what we're doing here is we're really just building the underlying technology for the Sustainability Fund, and then we're leaving discussion to disbursements for the community to decide after it's been implemented. We're intentionally neutral towards block reward recipients so that the implementation of the ZSF doesn't happen at the same time as decisions about how to disperse, the allocation. So what that means, for example, is if the ZSF was activated today, then the distribution of newly issued ZEC in block rewards would follow the split outlined in ZIP 1014, where 80% is allocated to the block miner, and then 20% gets allocated to the dev fund recipients, ECC, ZF, and ZCG. And then at the start, the ZSF is just funded by a percentage of transaction fees that's actually very, very small in terms of ZEC. But before we get into that, I just want to take a step back and talk a little bit about how the ZSF is designed. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the ZIP process and the 3 ZIPs that govern the Sustainability Fund. Next slide, please. So Zcash improvement proposals, or ZIPs, are the way to propose new features to the Zcash protocol and explain their rationale, specify implementation details, and document design decisions. You can think of the ZIP as like a technical specification that details its functionality or a project's functionality and explains how it operates under the hood. For this project, we have 3 ZIPs, and I'll briefly explain their purpose and the motivation behind them, and then Tomek will provide more technical details later in the presentation. But the first ZIP establishes the sustainability fund at the protocol level, and it allows funding from sources other than newly issued ZEC. Key proposed changes include maintaining a global balance at the consensus level called ZSF_balance, and it's tracked as a node state. And then we also add ZSF deposit field in transactions to facilitate contributions to the fund. The second ZIP smooths out the issuance curve by modifying how the block subsidy is calculated. Rather than adhering to Bitcoin's 4-year halving cycle, it proposes this exponential smoothing of the issuance curve that maintains the 21 million coin cap. We do this in order to sort of enhance the economic stability by making the distribution of block rewards more predictable and consistent over time without altering the issuance policy. So you don't get that shock that occurs every 4 years during the halving. And then the third ZIP deposits 60% of transaction fees into the ZSF. Now, it sounds like a large amount, but transaction fees are so small that we're confident that this would not, upset or shock miners. We were originally going to propose 90% of transaction fees to go to the ZSF, but we felt like optically it might be misinterpreted as a harsh tax on miners, despite it being a small amount. So the 60-40 split seemed like a relatively fair and neutral way to split transaction fees that would allow us to, allow the ZSF really to start accruing small amounts of ZEC. And now I also want to say a little bit about the ZIP process, because that was very interesting to work through. The process of writing and revising a ZIP can be very time consuming. Initially, we expected the ZIP process to take about 2 months, but it ultimately took more than 6 months. There were a few different reasons for the delays. First, it took us time to research and understand the protocol level changes required to establish the ZSF. And then second, the ZIP editors meet every 2 weeks, which introduces delays between receiving their feedback on a draft, making revisions, and then getting more feedback on those revisions. And then additionally, there's only so much attention or time that the ZIP editors have, and they often have to review other projects like Zcash shielded assets, and that can affect the timeline for feedback for our project. But having said that, the ZIP editors were extremely helpful and very approachable. We have a dedicated communication channel on Discord where we can ask them questions. They always respond in a timely manner. But their official and collective feedback, as well as the more or less approval of ZIPs, happens during the biweekly meetings. And then lastly, I want to mention that in our experience, the feedback from the ZIP editors focuses solely on the technical aspects of the ZIP. So they consider things like whether the proposal is focused and compatible with the existing protocol. Are there any security flaws? Does it conform with the requirements of existing ZIPs? And ultimately, is it something that can be implemented? So in our experience, the editors don't offer their personal opinions on the project or whether they support or oppose the proposed changes, unless we specifically ask for that feedback. Next slide. So next, I want to go over a few future use cases for the Zcash Sustainability Fund. As I've mentioned, we're proposing contributing a small portion of transaction fees to the ZSF, but there's a number of future changes that could facilitate additional deposits into the fund. And this again isn't our decision, nothing that we control. All of these would have to be ratified and approved by the community. So the first one is donations in ZEC. Donating to the ZSF is a neutral way to contribute to the sustainability of the network without favoring any specific organization or individual. Wallet apps, for example, could give users the option to donate to ZSF when making a transaction. This is something that can happen right off the bat. There are also donations in other assets. Like if you remember when Chris Goes from Namada announced a strategic alliance between Zcash and Namada, one thing that he mentioned was contributing NAM across a bridge to the Zcash ecosystem via the Sustainability Fund. So I think that's an interesting use case for it. Next are legacy support fees. So these can be instituted so that users relying on older protocol technology can compensate the network for the risk and cost of supporting that older technology. So like an example of this is, there could be fees for users storing their funds in an older pool. And this might incentivize them to move their funds into the new pool. Then Zcash shielded assets. So there are a number of applications here, like a portion of the fees associated with minting, destroying, transacting, or storing ZSAs could be deposited into the ZSF and contribute to the network security. So if somebody holds shielded Bitcoin, or as we call it, ZBTC, they could pay a percentage of their stored asset into the ZSF, sort of to give back to Zcash. And then privacy incentivization fees. So these could be introduced so that users who transact or store their ZEC and T addresses compensate Zcash users for the opportunity cost of a larger anonymity set. And then there are Ethereum EIP 1559 style fees. There could be a base fee transaction fee mechanism that automatically adjusts based on network congestion and where a portion of the fee is redirected into the ZSF. And that could provide a consistent and predictable source of funding. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it over to Tomek, who will discuss the technical details of the implementation.
All right, thank you, Jason. So as Jason has pointed out, the ZSF is a three-part effort. So it was split into three separate Zcash improvement proposals. And the first one is the ZIP 233. So this ZIP is really just about setting up, establishing the ZSF as an entity in the protocol. And it does this by doing two things. One is it creates this concept of a ZSF balance inside of the protocol. And then it creates ways for users and miners to donate to this ZSF balance. So what's important to understand is the ZSF balance is not going to be a Zcash address, right? So this is in contrast to, for example, how funding streams currently work. So if you look at the Zcash node code, funding streams are actually just plain Zcash addresses that are hard-coded in the Zcash node code base. So it's not going to be that. It's also not going to be stored anywhere in the blockchain. So the balance itself will not be visible anywhere in the block. It will have to be calculated and stored by each node. So basically, blocks and transactions will contain ZSF deposits. And if a node will want to know what the current ZSF balance is, it will have to go through the entire blockchain and calculate the current ZSF balance based on that. And the ZIP also introduces two ways of making ZSF donations. So the first one being from traditional non-Coinbase transactions. And this is done using the new ZSF deposit field. And the second way is using Coinbase transactions. So this is something that miners could use to donate to the ZSF. And they can do it by not claiming all Coinbase transaction inputs. So basically not spending all the coins that they could spend. So the ZSF deposit field will be added to transactions, to the transparent portion of the transaction entity. This will, of course, necessitate the introduction of a new transaction version 6. And basically, as I said, every transaction will be able to make a deposit using this field. So a maintainer of a wallet would basically allow the users, while creating a transactions, to make a deposit using this field by specifying a non-zero value in there. This, of course, affects things like transaction serialization IDs and hashes and related things. So these things will also need to be updated. And using coin-based transactions, what miners could do is they could not spend all available coins that they could spend in a coin-based transaction. So miners, when creating a coin-based transaction, they can spend obviously block rewards and transaction fees. What they could do is not spend all of those in their transaction outputs. So if the outputs will be smaller than the sum of things that they could spend, this will end up in the ZSF deposit. And curiously, this is something that has already happened in the past. Is it due to a technical error or on purpose? I don't know, but if I remember correctly, somebody from the electric coin company has reviewed past Zcash blocks and has found out that there are blocks out there in which miners did not claim all possible rewards. So this really resulted, up until this point, resulted in basically burning those coins. They were unavailable to the protocol. It was not possible to mine them again. And what's important to understand with this new definition of the ZSF deposit, those coins will get, we can call it unburned, right? They will end up in the ZSF deposit rather than being completely inaccessible. So this is something to be aware of. This is, of course, not a lot of coins. This didn't happen often, but yeah, it's good to be aware of that happening. So the second zip 234, is about smoothing out the issuance curve. So what we do here is we create a new function that, given a ZSF balance Z, will output a block reward. And this function needs to satisfy certain requirements because we do want to preserve the kind of the contract we have with the Zcash users currently. So obviously we don't want to accelerate the rate at which the coins are issued long term. So if we think about it, this function needs to be monotonically decreasing, right? We want this deflationary component of the Zcash protocol to still be there. And to satisfy this requirement which Jason mentioned, which is this mitigation of economic consequences of a halving, we want to make sure this function is more of a continuous function, right? It doesn't have those rough edges that halving produces. We want it to be more of a continuous function. We want it to be more than zero if the ZSF balance is more than zero. So we don't want any funds to be stuck in the ZSF. And of course, for any 4-year period, the sum of all paid out block rewards, it needs to be equal, more or less, to half of the ZSF balance at the beginning of that 4-year period, right? So we want to maintain that part of that property of halving. And it turns out, if you define a number, 4,126 divided by 10 billion, and you multiply any number really by this number, and calculate, well, if you calculate block rewards using this way, and you do it for a 4-year period for every Zcash block, then you will end up with 50% of the funds you had in the beginning. This is, of course, calculated using the property that 1 minus this number taken to the power of the number of blocks in a 4-year period we'll give you 50%, we'll give you a half. One extra thing that we do here is we round up. So this is to satisfy this requirement that we always want to have non-zero block rewards if the ZSF balance is non-zero. So this is what you end up with. Here you can see block subsidies paid out in a period of a bit over 20 years here. The blue line is the current issuance scheme, and the red line is the ZSF smooth issuance. And what you notice here, the red line is more or less continuous, and the sum of block rewards paid out in a 4-year period matches what would be paid out with the current issuance scheme. Another thing you might notice is block rewards in the first half of the 4-year period are actually higher than they would be with the current issuance scheme. This is something that some of the community members have been a little bit skeptical about, because it introduces this a little bit of a inflationary pressure which otherwise wouldn't be there. We could mitigate this if you look at the graph by moving the activation time by 2 years forward. This would actually introduce more deflationary pressure at the beginning. So immediately after activation, we would actually have less coins mined rather than more coins. If you want to play around with this, we have a tool online available on GitHub, and you can play around with the parameters and see how they affect the issuance and what other possible implementations we could have. And the last zip, zip 235, is about the 60/40 transaction fee split. This is really straightforward. What's important to understand here is that it is highly probable that this would be released either with or after zip 317, which redefines the way that transaction fees are calculated. Zip 317 makes the transaction fee dependent on the number of transaction inputs and the number of transaction outputs. So anytime you want to understand the consequences that this change would have on the protocol, you need to make sure you are looking at it under the zip 317 regime. And again, we have a tool that simulates this, or rather estimates the impact this would have on miners. And the estimated impact of this per year would be 210 coins. So this is not a lot. If you look at the current ZEC price, this would be anywhere from $4,000 to $6,000 per year. So it's not a significant sum. And so what is the current implementation status of this? The Zcash improvement proposals are ready for community review. So they are available on GitHub, and they have been mostly unchanged for the last couple of months. So feel free to review them and share your feedback. We have started implementing this on ZebRD, and that implementation, I would say, is around 60 to 70% complete. And we have a few weeks of work remaining there. We haven't started the zcashd implementation yet. It should take around 12 weeks is what we estimate. All right, I'm gonna hand it off to Jason.
Yeah, so a big part of the project outside of the technical development is building consensus and demonstrating community support for this change. We first started collecting sentiment on the forum last year, and overall, the community was pretty supportive of the change. There were some questions and some criticisms that came up, but I think we did our part to sort of address those. How we demonstrate consensus for this project is a little unclear. There are mechanisms like Zcap that the Zcash Foundation uses to pull the community. ECC just introduced their ZAC, but because we're a different organization, or Shielded Labs is a different organization, we don't want to rely on the ZF or ECC's method for gauging sentiment. And I think at the end of the day, if we issue upgraded software that contains a ZSF and enough Zcashers choose to run that software, then that should demonstrate the collective consensus of the community. But we really want to make the effort to know what the community thinks. And so our call to action is to encourage community members to voice their support or opposition or ask any questions about the Zcash Sustainability Fund. There's a thread on the forum that you can use to provide your feedback publicly, or you can reach out to me via DM on the forum or Twitter if you want to let me know what you think privately. And then one thing I'd like to occur is Shielded Labs intends to experiment with other methods of determining consensus. So one idea I've been thinking about for the past few months to a year is that the Zcash community has grown over the past couple of years, and a number of these distinct sub-communities have emerged. So each has its own sort of interests and perspectives. So examples include ZecHub, Zcash Global, Zcash Brazil, um, other vibrant communities in Russia, Venezuela, South Korea. So what I would like to do is ensure that the perspectives of these sub-communities are represented, and each and the way I think that this could work is that each sub-community could have a representative that's responsible for polling its community and gauging their opinions, and then could report back to us. So I'm sort of thinking about calling this a Zcash Community Council, and I will over the next couple months sort of give a little bit more detail about that. And I'll also be reaching out to the communities as well. But yeah, I think if, let us know what you think in the meantime. And if you have any ideas for ways we can better engage the community, please let us know. Thank you. The first question is, there is a lot of confusion regarding the smoothing of the issuance curve. Do you think it would be desirable to enable ZSF without it? And then Tomek, do you want to answer that from a technical perspective?
Yeah, from the technical perspective, that's definitely possible. This is exactly why we have split this entire ZSF effort into three zips, three parts. So they are decoupled as decoupled as possible. Yeah, so this is definitely possible, and something we have been thinking about from the very beginning to make sure that we have that capability if we need it.
Yeah, so from my perspective, this is something that I thought was going to be met with significant opposition. And in the end, on the forum, I think there's only been like one or two people who have really sort of brought up issues with this. So I was a little surprised about that. And to that extent, I think we need to sort of do a better job of having a conversation about this, because, it is a big change. Like, you shouldn't, just be able to willy-nilly change how the issuance works, right? So there are some benefits to smoothing out the curve, and I think it warrants a serious discussion with the community. And I think that's something that I will start in the immediate term, so that we can think about this and discuss it properly. The second question is, wouldn't 50-50 be a more wouldn't 50-50 be more neutral than 60-40 for transaction fees going into the ZSF? So this is something that we actually tried originally. The ZIP was written for a 50-50 split, but there were some technical reasons why you couldn't have a 50-50 split that Taylor had brought up. And Tomek, do you want to comment a little bit more on that?
Yeah, exactly. There's a good write-up by Tier on the forums about that. There are some kind of game theoretical aspects of how miners could abuse it. This is frankly something I haven't explored that much myself. So if you're interested in it, I encourage you to read Tier's post.
Okay, next question is, in a POS liquid staking Zcash, could the ZSF be staked to secure the network as well? And since we were having technical difficulties, we actually went through and answered these questions, and I think Tomek had a really nice answer to this question, so I will let him field this one.
Yeah, I guess staking is there to punish the member of the participant of the consensus for misbehaving, right? So it needs to be mapped. There needs to be a mapping between a node and some staked funds. So it doesn't really make sense to stake the ZSF funds because it would have to represent somebody, right? Somebody who runs a node. Also, one of the ideas that was proposed was that staking slashing penalties would actually end up in the ZSF. So you'd get that self-referential loop. That wouldn't make sense anyway. So yeah, that doesn't seem like something we could do.
Okay, and the last question is, given concerns about the issuance curve increasing inflation in the near term, if introduced at the halving, and the EOL of zcashd, does it make sense to push back activation until after zcashd deprecation and just implement it in for ZPRD? So that is something that we've been discussing recently, and we don't know the answer to that yet because there are some uncertainties. One thing that's clear is I don't think we're going to be able to have this ready to be activated in NU6. And that's because, really in order to do that, you need to have the implementation ready to go by July, and we may be a bit like completion may be after that. The second thing is, does it make sense to push back activation until zcashd is deprecated? Well, that's a discussion that the community is currently having, but that timeline is still, based on my knowledge, last I've heard, unclear. So we're not sure what the timing is, and so the answer to that question is maybe. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your time. And yeah, please reach out if you have any questions or want to provide us some feedback. Take care.